This year, we are supporting, we're not putting any money in a little pot anymore to try and keep the festival going year on year. We're supporting our local library, the town centre library, which may or may not, well, all libraries are under threat. And a new Friends of the Library group has started, and we're going to help them buy some books, or you are, by buying tickets. So thank you very much for that. Now, anyway, you don't want to listen to me. I am delighted to have Mr. Livingstone here. I have read his book. I hope you all go out and have a look at it. It is fascinating and interesting. If you're interested in politics as I am, you should listen to what this man says. And he said to me in the car, because when I was Mayor of London, I thought, what? You were the first Mayor of London, the greatest city in the greatest country on the planet. So that's pretty good, isn't it? He's right here in Wimborne. Ken Livingstone. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. And let me apologise for being a little wheezy, but it's the hay fever season. And it is a mistake to come into the middle of a wonderful countryside like this in the middle of hay fever season. On the train coming down, I can feel myself get more croaky. I want to start by taking up a point that you just said about things getting better, and that was a reference to the literary festival. But the simple reality is I'm part of a generation. I was born in 1945, just 6 weeks after the surrender of Germany. And I look back, my generation had the best quality of life in human history. The introduction of the health service, a welfare state. When I left school, just an ordinary school in Brixton, every boy got a job. I didn't know an unemployed person until I was 28. I grew up in a world where my parents had, of course, lived through, they'd been born in the First World War and they lived through the Depression. We just couldn't believe how things got better. And my parents, my dad was a window cleaner, but was able to buy a home in his early 40s. And I remember when I left school, I got a job as a technician at a cancer research unit. It sounds grand, but basically it was sweeping the floor and cleaning rat mess out the cages that they used for their experiments. But I was the first kid in my family to get a job with a pension. And that sort of through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, things were always getting better. And how many of us now could possibly persuade our kids or our grandchildren that that's the world we're in now? Things are getting worse. People get a degree from university and then they end up working a 0 hours contract, making sandwiches in a cafe just outside a main tube station or something like that. You wait, I can't imagine my kids would ever be able to afford to buy a home in London. It's all gone completely mad. And therefore we have to ask, why did it all go wrong? And I think part of that was shown in the week that Margaret Thatcher died. And you may remember Tony Blair was all over the airwaves saying, I believed it was my job to build on what she'd achieved rather than rolled it back. Pretty much the same sort of reaction from politicians when Ronald Reagan died. And there's one simple fact that we should focus on in all of this, because for the last 35 years in the Western world, we've had what they call the neoliberal economics of Thatcher and Reagan. And when Blair got in and Clinton got in, they broadly carried on those policies. But if you look at The Economist, the week Mrs. Thatcher died, it devoted 6 pages to looking at her record in politics, more than they've done for any other politician in my lifetime when they died. But nowhere in these 6 pages did they talk about investment or the growth of the economy. And exactly the same is true about America. In these last 35 years, where it's been about deregulating the banks, cutting taxes on the richest, doing away with all restrictions on the flow of money abroad and so on, all off to Panama and other dodgy places. I imagine so many of you've got your investments. Smash the trade unions. But at the end of it, the economies of Britain and America have not grown as strongly as they did in that post-war period when my generation was growing up. We don't have the levels of investment we had then. And investment's absolutely crucial. You look around, I'm travelling all over the place doing literature. I mean, it's amazing. It's like there's been an outbreak of literary festivals all over the country. I'm promoting this book from one after 2 or 3 a week sometimes. But wherever you go, the roads, as someone picks you up from the train station and drives you to where you're doing it, The roads are filled with potholes. Our infrastructure is terrible. I had to get the tube to get down to Waterloo Station this morning, and there are people held back, not able to get on the tube because it's so overcrowded, because we haven't been investing enough in modernising it. And of course the housing crisis is now as bad as it was at the end of the Second World War. That was after 5, nearly 6 years of Nazi bombing. We've inflicted this on ourselves. And the key to economic success is investment. If you look back and think, how could it be that Britain, which only had 2% of the world's population 200 years ago, became the greatest power on earth for a century, dominated the globe, and had the biggest empire in human history? It was actually because we were the first nation ever to invest 7% of our national wealth each year in the economy. Pathetic by today's standards, but gave us a huge advantage because all over Britain, entrepreneurs, businessmen, and they were of course all men in those days, were creating new products and processes. People were building railways and canals, and they literally passing that legacy on a family firm to their children and so on. It created employment and jobs. We were the leading exporter of the world. We were the leading nation in terms of technology and invention of new products and processes. And where we are now, we used to be in the top 2 or 3 nations of 20 OECD, the main Western economies, in terms of investment in research and development. Now we're in the bottom 2 or 3. And where do you see the entrepreneurs these days? They don't build something new. They just gamble in some dodgy deal with offshore accounts, or get their accountant to invest in a film that's never going to be made in bloody Hollywood and launder all the money through Panama or the Virgin Islands. The best and brightest minds aren't going into making new things. They're going into just tax dodging and all of that. And if you look at America, America's got more lawyers per head of population than any nation on earth. We've got more accountants per head of population than any nation on earth. And there's a lot of brilliant and talented people doing that, but imagine how much better it would be for all our citizens if that brilliance was being focused on developing new technologies, developing new products and processes, because we can't go back to the world of 40 years ago and just reopen all our old coal mines and all that old manufacturing, but we should be at the cutting edge of the new technologies. I get invited all over the world to usually advise mayors on how to do a congestion charge or build an underground or things like that. But when I'm in somewhere like Taiwan or Hong Kong, you can go onto the internet in like a tenth of the time you can here. And it's quite interesting. Back in 1983, we had an industry and employment unit at the Greater London Council, because all our old industries were under real pressure and declining, mainly in West London and the East End. And we were looking at the new ones that were coming along. And we produced a report that BT, which was then of course owned by the state, should create a fibre optic cable system linking every home and business and local and central government building into one real internet. We still haven't got that. You might have a fibre optic system coming to the edge of your town or something, or even down your road, but then it's into the Victorian copper wire, bringing it in to your home. And that's why it's so much slower here than it is abroad. And investing in transport, and then investing what now, in a sense, the internet's another form of transport, along with all the other technologies to tackle climate change and so on, could create really brilliant jobs and also help with our exports. Because although we've seen this dramatic reduction in our manufacturing, there's one simple fact, which is that half of all our exports are manufactured goods. And yet we've had this huge shift in our economy from manufacturing to services. That's not a bad thing, but we've allowed too much of our manufacturing to wither away. And half of your exports, and it's not just us, broadly across the world, because you can't export a bloody haircut, for God's sake. And the simple fact is, we've gone in the wrong direction for 35 years. And the truth is, in my lifetime, only 2 elections have really changed things. 1945, which brought the Labour government to power, and then when Churchill was re-elected in 1951, he broadly carried on those policies. They were never going to unwind the NHS. I can recall going to Conservative election rallies, not because I supported them, I just wanted the amount of interest, in the late 1960s, and Tory ministers would be saying, we will build more council houses than Labour. Literally, in that 25 years after the war, that 1945 election victory had actually set the political agenda. And then Mrs. Thatcher did exactly the same thing. And although I disagree with virtually everything she did, I respect the fact she actually believed in something. She didn't come into politics to become fabulously rich like somebody else I could mention. Nor did she care about whether people liked her or not. I mean, I do a Saturday morning radio programme with David Mellor, who was a minister in Thatcher's government and in John Major's cabinet. And he's remarkably honest because he's not seeking public office ever again. And I remember him saying, we got a huge influx of tweets and emails when he said it, that actually dealing with Saddam Hussein, he was a nicer person than Margaret Thatcher. And Thatcher didn't care whether you liked her or not. She believed that post-war consensus had failed, and she was trying to set a new one, just like Reagan was in America. And that's really why this book has appeared, because at the last mayoral election in 2012, it was so unpleasant and so dishonest. I thought I should write a book about that so that people in the Labour Party can read this in the run-up to the general election in 2015. So I wrote it. Every publisher refused to publish it. They said, we can't publish that. And then, fortunately for me, last year, the Left Book Club was reinvented. This was started in the 1930s. I think it had about 50,000 members. They produced all these books that people after work would sit around in the local pubs and talk about and so on. And that really set the political framework and agenda for that post-war period. And so I wrote it. No one was prepared to publish it until the Left Book Club came along. And I upgraded it then because by then, of course, we'd lost the 2015 election. And to everyone's amazement, including Jeremy's, he was emerging as the next leader of the Labour Party. And I included in that the things that I'd urged Ed Miliband and Ed Balls to do, which was to go into that election with a much more radical economic policy. We went in really a sort of austerity line. I mean, it's not a great election slogan to say we're not going to be as nasty as the Tories and things like that, but that's broadly what we did. And we failed. And if you look at elections, two factors really determine them. I mean, one, if you think back to 92, when to everyone's surprise John Major got elected, and all the polls have been indicating Labour would win. There were two factors in that analysis after we lost, Labour Party looked at. One was people thought John Major was nicer than Neil Kinnock, and that is a factor in elections. One of the reasons that of UKIP's popularity is people look at Nigel Farage and think, I'd like to have a chat with him in a pub. He comes over as someone that is engaging, and he actually is a pleasant person to have a chat in a pub with, so I've done myself. But the other factor is that Labour went into that election without a very convincing economic strategy. And those are the two key issues. And that's why I was delighted when Jeremy suddenly surged into the scene, because he was advocating exactly the sort of policies I've been advocating in the Labour Party for decades, that we should massively increase our investment and that we should crack down on all these tax dodgers. Because if you look back to that post-war era, corporation tax produced about the same income to the Chancellor's Treasury as income tax did. Now it's about 1/6. All the corporations have found ways to launder their money. So, Google and Starbucks and Amazon, year after year, they pay no tax. And this is just fundamentally wrong. Countries didn't allow that to happen in those days. Corporations did have to pay their tax. And one of the big mistakes of Mrs. Thatcher was the first thing she did in the first few days of her government was to remove the controls on the export of money. Now, I'm not saying you go back to the world as it was in the 1970s. But you can stop all this tax avoidance quite simply. Perhaps instead of a corporation tax, which is, small and medium-sized firms end up usually having to pay, it's the giant corporations that avoid it. But, if Starbucks doesn't want to pay any tax and launders its money abroad and doesn't pay any corporation tax, let's switch it to a tax on turnover. If you say, you're about to spend, pay 10% of all your earnings on each cup of coffee, you can't dodge that in the same way that firms can't dodge the business rate. And that's what, Jeremy is advocating. It's not, I know there's a few fabulously rich celebrities who also launder their money around the world, but that's peanuts compared with these giant corporations. And if you do look at that post-war period, British firms had a sort of loyalty to their own country. Even if they didn't like the politicians and the Prime Minister, they felt part of that. But now, Google and Starbucks and the others don't just not pay tax here, they don't pay it anywhere. They don't have any loyalty to any country on the face of the planet, or any people. We've moved into a genuinely global economy, and we need to actually restructure our laws so that that economy is fair. Because the more that the great international corporations avoid paying tax, the more small and medium-sized firms in this country have to, and the more ordinary people have to pay tax, and to make up that gap. So Jeremy's got an economic strategy I also find interesting. Although in that little media elite world around Whitehall, where the politicians and the journalists all generate all their own old nonsense and their own interpretation, it doesn't reflect the public view. Every day after Prime Minister's questions in most of the papers says, Jeremy was awful, Jeremy failed again. Yet people stop and say, I thought it was really nice. He doesn't shout and scream, and he doesn't make nasty point scoring and so on. I remember, I don't know if you recall, when John McDonnell changed his mind on a part of our economic strategy and said so in part, I've changed my mind. People said, I've never heard a politician admit to changing their mind before. And therefore I do think that that next election in 2020, like 1945 and 1979, could be a game changer. And I'm stomping all over the place, urging people to get involved in the Labour Party and get Jeremy elected, because I want my children and grandchildren to have the sort of chance in life that my generation had. And it would be outrageous if we continue this decline. Oddly enough, I've just been reading a biography of Jesus Christ, and as an atheist since the age of 12, I'm not normally devoting much of my time to reading about religion. And it came out about 20 years ago. It's called Jesus Christ, a Revolutionary Biography. And it's somebody an academic who spent their lifetime reading not just the Bible, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything else from the ancient past, trying to put together a real picture of what Jesus was really saying, because there's an awful lot that's contradicted in the Gospels. And one of the things that struck me as I read this, the guy says, in the world of the Roman Empire, the top 1% owned 50% of all the wealth. And I thought, my God, nothing's changed, And there was Jesus making the case for the poorest and a fairer distribution of wealth. Now, I'm not suggesting he was some Trotskyist or something like that, but I suspect that may have been why he was bumped off as rapidly as possible, because he was a threat to those established interests. And it also brings me on to another point, which is I've always loved reading about history. I was quite annoyed when I was a kid at school and there was a shortage of history teachers, so in my final year at school we didn't have any history lessons. And I read a bit of science fiction, natural history, but my main interest is in history. And I've been in this row in the last couple of weeks about what I said about Adolf Hitler. And what I found amazing about that was that the people who stopped me on the streets or sent me emails and so on say, like, I'm Jewish, I know my history. Why didn't these MPs read history? And it made me think, if Thatcher and Reagan and Clinton and Blair had read the history of the economics of the 1920s and 1930s, we might have avoided the banking crisis. They wouldn't have deregulated the banks. And whenever I try and talk about history, interviews say, we're not interested in history, it's all the past. But nothing really changes. Our technology changes, but humans carry on making the same mistakes century after century. I remember when I was leader of the GLC, We took control. It's 92 members on the council. We had a majority of 4. And out of the Labour group, at least a quarter of them wanted me dead and were doing anything possible to undermine me. So the Tories were always demanding special meetings to discuss something where I was vulnerable. A couple of rebels would have let the Tories win the vote. And I just realised, yep, I've got to call a special meeting. I'll do it on Friday afternoon. Because there's a handful of the Tories are so rich, they've gone to their country estates. And I never lost a vote on Thursday afternoon. And then a couple of years later, I'm reading Suetonius's History of the 12 Caesars, which he wrote shortly after the death of the Emperor Nero. And bugger me, there is Julius Caesar, who's seen as the dangerous radical by all the Conservatives in the Senate. And whenever they demand a special meeting, he calls it on Friday afternoon. So I say to him, don't ignore history. It goes round and round in circles. I mean, the banking crisis isn't something that just happened in the 1929 and then in 2008. It's come round in cycles throughout the period of capitalism. I mean, there's a very brilliant biography of President Andrew Jackson by Arthur Schlesinger, must be 60 years old now. And he was president from 1828 to 1836. And the Bank of America had a big crash. Now, the president of the bank went to prison for that. I mean, I wish we had the same sort of approach to our bankers here. Because of the appalling risks that were taken. And I can't remember now whether it's one of Jackson's cabinet or it might have been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, says in about 1832, we must never again allow the corporations to be too big to fail. I mean, it's just breathtaking. We've gone round and round in these cycles and circles. But I mean, the simple reality for all of this is what do you do to change it? And I mean, this is my real disagreement with Tony Blair. I don't denounce him so much for lying about Iraq, because I don't think he did lie. He genuinely believed there were weapons of mass destruction. I was mayor by then. I was having to work with key staff, and I remember just after the invasion and Saddam's disappearance, his key person aide was meeting me to discuss things we were doing in London, and she was saying, we'll find the WMDs by the autumn. I've no doubt about that. And I think the Chilcot report will be damning about Blair's failure to really bear down on the very pathetic intelligence that they were getting and not really question all that. But no, he genuinely believed that. But what he didn't believe in really was the Labour Party. As I said, he's that line about, I thought it was my job to build on Thatcher's work, not roll it back. Obviously, Bugger had told us that when he was running for Labour leader. I remember when he was running for Labour, he said, I think it's my job to build on John Smith's achievements. And there isn't much I agree with Michael Howard, the old Tory leader, about. But did this interesting thing. When Tony Blair was elected to Parliament in 1983, Michael Howard was very interesting. He was a man of immense talent and ability. And he invited him and Cherie to dinner. Cherie hated it. She couldn't stand being in the same room with Michael Howard. But Blair got on really well with him. And afterwards, Michael Howard, writes biography or whatever, he thought that actually Tony Blair wasn't really Labour at all. More likely at heart a Conservative. Why therefore was Tony Blair in the Labour Party? It wasn't a plot. It wasn't some evil establishment conspiracy to take over the Labour Party. He was just besotted with Cherie, and she was deeply involved in the Labour Party. She wasn't going to marry him. He wasn't in the Labour Party with her. Now that is bizarre, but history turns on very odd points like that. But having got the leadership, I remember campaigning for him very hard, because it never occurs to me he actually believed all the rubbish he was coming out with in the run-up to the 97 election. I thought this is just to calm down the nerves of the Tory media and things like that. When we get in, we'll be much more radical and we'll do more radical things. But of course, I was wrong. He was saying what he actually believed. But then he went on to change the Labour Party, and this is what I think I most deplore about his record. When I joined the Labour Party in 1969, I could go to my local ward meeting, be about a dozen people sitting around, we'd talk about what was happening, we'd pass a motion, it would go up to our local Labour Party, Some of them would then go on to the annual conference. And, I mean, effectively, it was a way in which ordinary people had an influence over politics. I mean, local Labour parties could select whoever they wanted as their local candidate. Otherwise, someone like me or Jeremy would never get in. But then Blair introduced new rules. I mean, the party conference wasn't allowed to determine our policy. It was done by a thing called the National Policy Review, which all stuck with people he put on it. Local parties weren't allowed to choose the candidate they want. You had to choose from a list that had been approved by party bureaucrats. You had to go to a hotel in Brighton or something for the weekend where these bureaucrats would quiz you and make sure you weren't dreadful lefty like me or Jeremy or something like that. And they didn't get on the list. They weren't allowed to stand. Ordinary councillors who'd served for years were told they couldn't seek re-election. And do you know the excuse given? Was because they lacked sufficient life skills. What on earth is the lack of sufficient life skills? When Tony Blair created the mayoralty in London, because Tony Blair's in love with all things American. He hated being a prime minister, he wanted to be a president, and as well as creating a mayor, they created the London Assembly. And 236 Labour Party members in London applied to go on the list to stand. 136 were told they lacked sufficient life skills. Now, this was outrageous. So oddly enough, I got elected as mayor, and then there's this block of Labour people in the Assembly that I couldn't believe how right-wing they all were. So poor old Jeremy's inherited a Labour Party skewed massively out of thinking, not just with Labour Party members, but with how ordinary people think and feel. And he's involved now in a deep struggle to change all that. And that's why I'm delighted to be promoting this book, because it is going to be a dirty old campaign. I think back to the elections I've been involved in. This last one in 2012 against Boris. Boris had had a brilliant 4 years. I can't think of any other man on the face of this planet that's been so good at promoting himself as Boris had done. There's only two things that Boris created and built. One was the cable car to nowhere, and the other was that revolving ArcelorMittal thing that looks down on the Olympic Stadium. But it was, really interesting old campaign. And people were telling me, I had a Tory canvasser knock on my doorstep and said, if you're elected mayor, you're going to introduce Sharia law. Now at the time, as an atheist since 12, at the time, the Evening Standard was running a campaign saying I was an alcoholic. It's difficult to equate Sharia law and alcoholism. And it really was absolute conditions. Then, of course, you had Cameron getting up in Parliament saying I was a tax dodger. And if only I'd known about his dad's bloody tax affairs at that time. Or if I'd known then that George Osborne's family firm hasn't paid any tax for 8 years. But it was really unpleasant. I wanted to talk about the environment, the housing crisis, our air quality problems. It was all these smears, and it would be just like that in and up to 2012. So what we're doing in the Labour Party is trying to build a grassroots organisation again. And it's amazing. We've now got more members than all the other political parties put together. Huge wave of people, mainly young people coming in, a bit like support for Bernie Sanders in America. Because young people are very gloomy about their future. They look for someone who will really properly change that. And so expect over the years, the next 4 years, anything. The media will do anything rather than want to talk about Jeremy's economic strategy or anything like that. And part of that problem is now 2/3 of the papers we read are owned by 4 billionaires, all of them tax dodgers. Lord Rothermere, who owns the Mail and is domiciled in France, so that he doesn't have to pay tax here. The Barclay brothers, who are domiciled in one of the Channel Islands, I expect they almost never bloody go there, but they just don't own there. So the Telegraph doesn't have to pay, they don't have to pay tax. And then of course there's Rupert Murdoch. And I always say, I think one of the failures of the Labour Party was not to recognise that immigrants can do terrible damage to this country. You just have to think of Rupert Murdoch. But I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember, when I came into politics, every politician read the Times, because it was the paper of record, absolutely accurate. Now I hardly believe a word I read in it. So it's going to be a dirty old campaign. But for those of you who want a better life for your children, your grandchildren, don't just buy my book and pass it on to them. Get involved in changing our country. Get involved in, if you can't stomach the thought of joining the Labour Party, and I know this isn't the Socialist Republic down here, get involved in the campaigns about housing or the campaigns about the environment. Because that's the point I'll conclude on. Because when I came into politics, it was that background as a cancer technician. I was always taught to focus on the truth. If you turned up with a couple of conflicting experiments in terms of their results, the doctor or the professor wouldn't say, "Oh, let's go with that one, just shred the other one." They sent you back to do it again and again until you found the truth. And one of our problems is almost no one from a scientific background comes into politics. Not at all. Most of the people who go through Parliament, they did politics and philosophy and economics at uni. Usually they dropped economics and just concentrated on politics and philosophy. And yet focusing on the facts is crucial. And one of the problems is that scientists understate things. Scientists do not run around like Donald Trump coming out with a load of old blather. They're very cautious. They'll only say something when they're absolutely certain it's true. And the politicians they're briefing about climate change don't understand that. Mrs. Thatcher, in her first briefing from the head of the government science unit, told about climate change in 1979. Her response was, "You mean I've got to worry about the weather? But look at the weather now. I know what it's like down here, but I walk my dog in our local park each day. And in the last year, I've seen more trees blown over in our park than in my lifetime. I feel the strength of the wind. If you're in one of those areas that suffered the catastrophic flooding last year, wherever we're looking around the world, weather is getting more extreme. This horrendous fire that you've got in Canada. And that's the result of just a 1 degree Celsius increase in our temperature. And we're headed towards at least another 1 degree, and if we're unlucky, 2 or 3. It's the biggest threat that we face, because it isn't just going to be that the next 1 degree will be twice as bad. All the extra energy that's going into our atmosphere is making it more and more extreme and more violent. And I tell you this, I said we need to look at manufacturing. What we should be doing is leading the world in developing the technologies that allow us to avoid the catastrophe of climate change, insulating all our homes, coming up with the alternatives, eliminating waste. That post-war world I grew up in, nothing was wasted. I remember every Easter and every Christmas we had a chicken. For 2 days afterwards you ate the cold meat. On the final day, my mum would boil the bones to make a soup. Now, a third of the food that's made in this country is thrown away and wasted. How many of the things your children and grandchildren are given, they play with for a couple of days and then they're dumped to one side? We need to tackle climate change, and it would be a massive, labour-intensive, creating good jobs in order to do that. So I say, however depressed you might be about where we all are, for my generation, I shouldn't be depressed. I'll be dead before it all gets horrendously wrong. I've got a nice pension and all of that. But get involved in changing our world so we can give our children the best quality of life in human history. Thank you very much. Your turn. Listen. You can ask anything you like. No one's going to be as rude as I had to put up with in the House of Commons. Lady here. Well, I didn't equate. I was being interviewed by a BBC presenter about, is there a wave of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? And I have to tell you, 47 years of the party, I've never heard anyone say anything anti-Semitic. There's a very interesting letter in The Guardian about 10, 12 days, nearly a fortnight ago now, from 80 Jewish Labour Party activists saying they'd never heard anything anti-Semitic. It's all been whipped up on the back of half a dozen mad people who joined the Labour Party in that great wave and said stupid things. They've all been thrown out partying. But back in 1983, Lenny Brenner, an American journalist who used to work on the Jewish Guardian, came to Britain to launch his book about Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. And it caused us a stir because most people hadn't studied that sort of history. And I was asked about Hitler, and I said, well, you've got two phases in Hitler's policy. I mean, in the Second World War, he killed 6 million Jews and millions of others. But in the 1930s, when he won the election, he signed a deal with the Zionist movement in Germany, and that was to move, and they did move 60,000 German Jews to what is now Israel. If they hadn't done that, they would have been killed. There was a lot of controversy around that because most of the Jewish organisations around the world were trying to organise a boycott of Hitler's goods. They thought that they were being undermined. That's a simple statement of fact. I wasn't being judgmental. And then you get this wave of embittered opt-out MPs saying, here's another thing to divert attention from the local election campaign and undermine Jeremy. And I'm suddenly overwhelmed by all this stuff. And all I say to people is, it takes all of 10 minutes to go on the internet and find this. I mean, the deal was signed by the leader of the Mapai party. I can't remember his name. He was assassinated a few years later in the autumn of 1933. That Hitler would agree to the transfer of the Jewish community in Germany out to what was in Palestine. He also passed a law that said only 2 flags can be flown in Germany, the swastika and the Zionist blue and white flag. And also, he passed a law banning rabbis in Germany from delivering their sermons in German because they were told they had to do it in Hebrew, which had virtually died out as a language by then. So he did actively support Zionism in the 1930s. He didn't like Jews, he wanted to get rid of them all, but you need to just understand history. I just don't understand why this was such a... So the thing that annoyed me the most, all these journalists turn up to interview, not one has bothered to check whether it was the truth. I mean, 30 years ago when I was interviewed by journalists, they would have done lots of research, they knew as much as I did about the subject. Now it's saying, what's your response to the latest smear, Mr. Livingstone? If people were offended by that, I'm sorry, but I think disproportionately most of our Jewish community must know about the history of Zionism. It just comes as a shock to a generation of people who've grown up not studying history, I'm afraid.
If I can say that the quote was that you said that Hitler was a Zionist.
No, I didn't.
And that was what was quoted.
Now, you may have read that in the Mail or the Telegraph. That's not what I said. What I said was, Hitler supported Zionism in the 1930s and then he went mad and killed 6 million Jews in the 1940s. I didn't want to talk about Hitler. I mean, being interviewed about the Labour Party today, but I'm asked by a BBC journalist about Hitler, and I have to say, perhaps my biggest mistake in politics, I've always answered the question I'm asked. I should have been trained by Tony Blair's team to manage to avoid answering it. Gentleman there. Well, if we do vote to leave, Cameron will be gone in days, and my real fear is Boris will be the Prime Minister within a few weeks, and so we're getting ready to immigrate somewhere else. All the talk is about London's booming and dramatic and wonderful, and it certainly is, but ordinary Londoners are just being left behind. My youngest boy, his best mate, their parents have just had to move to Leicester. They can't afford to continue paying rent just around the corner from us. I live in an ordinary 4-bedroom terraced house, 115 years old. If I was renting that, it'd be £750 a week. And our air quality, I mean, you're most likely better off down here. In London, 9,500 people die every year because the air quality is so bad. Boris has said, well, we need to have a scheme in place by 2020. Well, a lot of people are going to die while you wait for that. I persuaded Gordon Brown, just before I lost the election, to give the Mayor's office £5 billion to start building council housing. Boris didn't touch it. And I mean, just after the Olympics, the only social engagement I've had with Boris, he said, let me take you out to dinner at my local Turkish restaurant. I'll spend the evening droning on about the need to build homes for rent. And I said homes for rent, he said homes for rent. And the shock in his voice, it's like I'd asked if I could sleep with his wife. And you just realise, this little Bullingdon Club elite, they have no idea what it's like to struggle to get somewhere to live. And then he spent the rest of the evening asking why it was I failed to become Prime Minister, because he didn't want to repeat the mistake. And although he's seen as this, lovely, charismatic, friendly fellow, he's absolutely done virtually nothing. And I think if he does become Prime Minister, he doesn't have an agenda for what he's going to do for Britain either. It'll be like it's been in London, just deferring all the difficult decisions. So we need, desperately, vote to stay in, because you may not like Cameron, but Boris will be even more damaging.
Personally, I'm supporting Osborne.
Osborne, that's why I want nice regular guy Jeremy up against Britain's most obnoxious snob. Yeah. Come over here. Get on the back. Well, when I got involved in politics in the late 60s, Parliament was filled with people who'd been their local council leader and arrived in Parliament in their 40s or 50s, people who'd run businesses. On the Labour side, similarly, a lot of people from local government backgrounds, a lot of people who run trade unions and so on. There were very few people coming in at the age of, in their late 20s, who'd just been policy advisors. And I think this is what's diminished our politics. There is no shortcut to actually learning how to run a country. I watched, Tony Blair asked to see me just before he became Prime Minister. He was sounding me out for a job. And I came away thinking, you're so not ready for this. Because you look at that Labour leadership, Blair, Brown, Mandelson and Campbell, none of them had ever run anything in their lives. And I just watched Tony Blair make mistakes as Prime Minister that I made as a 27-year-old councillor for the Vice Chair of Housing on my local council. And literally, you can't, a bit, almost as bad with Obama, I think. And equally with Cameron. Cameron's never run anything. He was my media advisor and things like this. We should have a law against this. You should be forced to actually run something before you get an old bloody country to run. Or more people like you should get back into politics. Nowadays we've got to stop this nonsense that everyone's looking for some bright and attractive young person coming into politics. It doesn't matter if you're ugly or old. It's a question of, do you know how to run things? So, over here, at the back. Well, the future's easy. We've got to start investing in our country again. Under Edward Heath, we achieved our best ever year in 1973. 20% of our GDP went into investment. Germany that year did 25%, and they always were doing a bit better than us. So it's getting that investment, both the public sector investment, building homes and roads and modernising your transport and all that, and then that opens the way for private sector investment to come in and build around the transport hubs you've created. Also investing in giving people better skills. It's like when I was at school, there were kids, a small number, only about 1 in 20 went to university, but we had about 30 woodwork and metalwork shops in our school, so kids were trained in those skills. They were trained how to lay bricks and so on, and then they left school, they got an apprenticeship, they got into a job. We just had some blinds put up in our house, and the guy said, I'm afraid they're going to be about a week late. The boat bringing them from China has been delayed. Why can't we have people learning woodwork in our schools? They could build the bloody blinds here. This is nonsense. It's not that immigrants have taken all of our jobs. We failed to train our kids coming through school because not everyone's an academic, and they should be given those skills for the technology that we've now got. And I don't understand. What's the thing I'm proudest of? I suppose back when I was 25, we were drawing up the election manifesto for Lambeth Council. There was an old age pensioner locally campaigning to say the buses are empty between the rush hours, why don't we let pensioners travel on them free? And there was only a committee of about 15 of us drawing up the manifesto. There was a big row about this because it wouldn't be cheap. We won that vote. Never occurred to me I'd live long enough to get one myself. But every day, a million pensioners are getting on a bus or a tube or a train in London and able to get them. If we didn't have that, those pensioners were being squeezed out of London now because it's so damn expensive. And there's all the other things, like taking up the issues which are you won't remember now, but in the 1987 election, the Tory campaign said, we will introduce a bill to stop schools promoting homosexuality. Well, no schools promoting homosexuality. They never found a school. I had people on the doorstep saying, I've always been Labour, I can't vote for you this time because of all this homosexuality in our schools. Now we've come a long way. Now we've got Prime Minister, Tory Prime Minister has pushed through gay marriage, and if it hadn't been for the reaction, he's going to make it compulsory for everybody. Yes, yes. Well, as you've just seen in the last 2 weeks, anyone who raises that issue gets so much flack. I mean, if I denounce the government of South Africa because it's riddled with corruption, no one says I was a racist. And I mean, the Netanyahu government must be about the worst in Israel's history. And the real tragedy is, when Rabin did that deal in 1993 with Yasser Arafat, it looked like here was the chance of creating a genuine two-state solution where the barriers would come down, there could be trade between the two. And then he was assassinated about a year later. And there's been no Israeli Prime Minister with the strength of character and courage to actually say these are issues that we've got to face. It's much easier for you to say, we're just doing all right as we are and so on. And here we are 68 years after the creation of the State of Israel and still terrible insecurity. How long is it before some terrorist group does finally get their hands on weapons of mass destruction and uses them? And the tragedy is, I don't see any rival to Netanyahu who looks likely to defeat him at the election and come up with a coherent alternative. I just pray for that. I'll continue to talk about it. But I have to tell you, the number of times when I've been coming on to do a radio or TV programme, they say, what do you want to talk about? I say, well, the crisis in the Middle East. Oh, no, we don't want to deal with that. No. We get so much flack if we deal with that. And shutting down the debate isn't helping Israel. We need a proper open debate. Someone over here? Yes. Well, I'm sure one of the reasons so many Labour MPs were demanding my suspension is they want me off the NEC when we have to vote on Trident. But let me tell you, when Blair proposed that 4 new nuclear submarines back in 2006, they're going to be 20 billion. Now they're definitely at least 40. But the cost of running them, most people put it at 160 billion over 30 years. And if you say, Bruce, should we have nuclear weapons? And most people say yes. You say, do you mind paying £5,000 in income tax to support that? And they might change their mind. And when you talk privately to military people, most of them think it's a complete waste of money. We've now got the smallest army since the Napoleonic War. We've got 2 aircraft carriers coming into operation in a few years, but without any aircraft on them. We haven't got the number of boats necessary to protect them. We've allowed our traditional armed forces to be withered away, and the real threat, Putin's not going to come along and invade Britain. His economy's in a real mess. The Germans spend half as much on their military as we do. They're a lot closer to Russia than we are. The threat we will face, even if we can destroy ISIL, there will be other terrorist groups coming, not just on the Muslim groups, but from the far right and everything else. Terrorism, I think, is going to be a fact we have to live with for decades to come. And you tackle that not by having nuclear submarines, but many more police on our streets. When we used to have neighbourhood police, that's the way in which the police find information. People get to know their local copper. They'll stop and say, something dodgy going on in that house just down the road and things like that. And we've lost almost all our beat police in London. I don't know what it's like down here. But also you need to, we couldn't do anything now really to tackle ISIS in Syria because we haven't got a military strong enough and big enough to do it. And that's left us in a very weak position. And therefore I just think it's a complete waste of money to spend on 4 nuclear submarines. Prime Ministers love being able to go around and say, we are a nuclear power. It's helped overcome the erectile dysfunction of so many of them in their Middle Ages.
I'm going to spoil the party.
Oh God, I've got to sign some books.
I'm going to spoil the party now, folks. And I know you don't want it to stop, do you? No. Right, but I'm sure you'll be able to have a few words when he signs his book, which we've got loads of copies. I want to see that table empty, by the way. But while I'm here, I need to. There we are.
I just realised this is the first public meeting I've done in 45 years where I ended on the subject of erectile dysfunction. Let's hope the Daily Mail is here.
I had so many people come to see me or phone me up and say, Malcolm, is Ken still coming? Is Ken thinking that the adverse publicity in the press was going to make me go, oh no, we can't have this over along. They would have spoilt it, wouldn't they? Yes, wouldn't they just? Well, I've had the most amazing talk, Ken. Wonderful. Where is he? Gone.
I'm just coming down to sign the books.
He's coming down Sunday. I need to give you something first. Okay, while you're in front of everybody. There we are.
Well, I'm not saying I'll get round.
Hold on.
Thanks very much.
Right, there we are. And it's red. There we are.
That'll keep the game in one day. Thanks very much.